The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. This week, it's an hour on the substance that's necessary for both life and civilization to thrive. I'm talking, of course, about water. Dr. Marc Grynpas joins us to discuss the health benefits and safety implications of water fluoridation. But first, we're joined by Dr. William James for a look at the history and technology behind the water that flows in and out of your life on a daily basis. Thanks for listening. I'm here with William James, president of Computational Hydraulics International, a family-run consulting engineering company that specializes in urban water design software systems. Bill has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, a postgraduate diploma of Hydraulic Engineering, a PhD from Aberdeen University, and a Doctor of Science from the University of Natal. He's also Professor Emeritus of Engineering at the University of Guelph. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So before we get into the history of water systems, I have to ask, your company works with urban water design software systems. So can you tell us what that is?
We develop software that manages mostly urban drainage. We cover detection of approaching rainstorms through radar and through NASA satellite technology. And then we compute the gathering waters as the water falls on rooftops and road surfaces and lights and gathers in gutters and flows down the sewers and ditches and creeks and rivers. We compute all of the flows and the pollutants and the depths. And the software goes on to estimate the pollutant levels and flows into a receiving water, such as, say, Lake Ontario, and the ensuing distribution of the pollution in the lake. Is that enough?
Well, that's actually far more advanced than the way this all started out. If we're looking at the history, I guess the first water technology occurred in the Middle East?
Well, what we now call the Middle East, yeah. I guess in those days it was the center.
Right. So what sort of techniques did they use, and what time period would that be?
Well, it was probably 2000 BC, and various countries still have traces of these original wells, and they dug tunnels into the side of a hill in order to reach the part of the soil that was moist, and then the tunnel would start flowing, obviously, with water. And then they led these tunnels out of the side of the hill and into the various communities. And when there'd been a lot of rain, then these tunnels flowed. They're called qanats, and they still exist all over the Middle East.
So they still exist. So there's also archaeological evidence of this.
Oh, yes. They're in use for various communities in Oman and Iran, and the Romans used similar systems as well. But that was 2,000 years later.
You mentioned Rome. So what were the first water systems like there?
Well, they were very impressive, and of course there's remnants of them all over Europe and the Middle East. And they were similar, except that they had a more methodical method of distributing the water. They built distribution reservoirs, and they used pipes for the first time. You know, the whole history of water supply mirrors the history of materials and materials engineering. And in the early days, we only had wood and stone and rock and so on. And then later on, metals, copper and lead. And the Romans were able to use a combination of lead and stone. Everybody is aware of the fact, I think, that the Romans had good water supply systems and supplied a copious amount of water to the communities, but the reality is that their systems flowed all the time. So a lot of the water that was being supplied was actually being wasted.
Well, what's the alternative?
Well, I guess there was no alternative. In Europe in the Middle Ages, they delivered water by hand. The community would provide half a dozen wells, and then folks had to go and fetch the water. The system of piping the water to the people is obviously much more convenient.
So what is it really about the Romans' water systems that set them apart?
What was different, I think, was the realization that public health depended upon adequate supply of unpolluted water and the need to carry away wastes. And I think they were sufficiently alert to this that they provided public washrooms for the working class people. Later on, the more influential people were able to persuade the authorities to pipe the water to their own homes. But that was not official. That was sort of a form of corruption, actually.
Were they aware that this was a health issue?
Oh, yes, I think so. They were aware of a lot of things that we forgot about in the ensuing 1,000 years. They were aware of the fact that lead was poisonous and had a bad effect on public health. They knew that, though, not so much from the water, which is what we all assume today, but from the fact that the people who worked in the mines and digging out the lead became sick.
Well, you've written about safe water supply systems as being linked to population growth as well.
Well, that's right. It does seem to me that most of the significant explosions of population were coincide with advances in water treatment. The ability to separate the waste water from the drinking water led to a vast improvement in health and a reduction in the death rate.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking about water systems with William James, Professor Emeritus of Engineering at the University of Guelph. Let's go back to the Middle Ages. So that was the chamber pot era, was it not?
Yeah, I guess so. Throwing the stuff out of the windows.
That's what I picture, yes.
That wasn't the worst aspect. I mean, that was bad enough, but the worst aspect was the fact that people stored their waste in the basements, and they had these huge cesspools of anoxic mixtures down there in which there was a lot of methane and gases being given up, and there were some really catastrophic experiences with poisonous gases. Today, when we developed the township, we put the drains in first, and then after that you put in the water supplies. But in those days, the Middle Ages and so on, the people consumed the water without providing for the drainage, and that's what led to these really unhealthy situations.
So what techniques were they using then?
I'm not really sure, but of course in earlier large cities like Paris and London, they had to deal with the drainage, and basically sewers were developed to carry waste water and waste products to the sea. And that's what the name means. It's seaward is a sewer.
Right.
Sewer goes seaward. So those sewers were simply drains, ditches, and so on.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking with William James, president of Computational Hydraulics International, about the history of water systems. And we'll be right back with more after this.
Skeptically Speaking wants you to question everything. To be a part of the discussion, call and record your question on our listener question line at Speak 73101. That's 773-257-3101. Long-distance charges may apply. Sunday nights at 6 Mountain Time, join our Ustream chat room to listen and ask questions as we record interviews live. Just click the Listen Online button at skepticallyspeaking.com. You can also email your questions and comments to live@skepticallyspeaking.com, or if you're on Twitter, tweet us at Skeptical Radio. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell, and I'm here with William James, Professor Emeritus of Engineering at the University of Guelph. He's also president of Computational Hydraulics International, and we're talking about water systems. So the real advances in quality control in water, at least in the USA, didn't really come until the mid-20th century, correct?
Well, there have been continuous advances. As engineering improved, we went from cast iron to steel. We were able to build pumps, for example, that were able to deliver more water at a higher pressure. And because the components were able to spin faster and they were able to resist higher pressures. So we moved from simple reciprocating steam-driven pumps towards centrifugal pumps. All of these advances go hand in hand with materials. And I'm not able to say real advances occurred at any particular point. I see it more as a continuum, I should say.
Well, I'm thinking basically the separation of sanitary and storm sewers.
I think that there was quite a lot known about that from early ages. But we suffered in Canada West, in this part of Ontario, quite badly in about the 1840s and the 1850s with cholera. Mainly people who were infected were coming from Europe, but they'd been living in the close confines of these sailing ships for a month or two, and their water had obviously become polluted. And we needed, at that point, to do something about the death rates. And there was a physician in London by the name of John Snow who very courageously had persisted in his theory that these diseases were spread by contaminated water, and the link between wastewater or human excreta getting into the water. And people were in those days simply taking the water out of the Thames downstream of the wastewater effluvia. And I think he was able to show quite convincingly that was the link. That came across to Canada, that information, and so we were able to separate it. The simple act of separating the wastewater from the drinking water led to a big population growth.
You did mention that some of the strategies even used in medieval Europe are still used today in underdeveloped areas.
Well, I don't want to point fingers at any place, and it's hard. You know, if you mention places, you have run the risk of being offensive.
Right.
But, where there's no resources and people are very poor and desperate and they're in need of adequate water, there are a lot of organizations that get in and try and help, of course, as there were in the old times. But the main cry that goes out that I have trouble with is that there's a shortage of water. And you'll see this all the time. You'll go on the web and you'll find all kinds of conferences and organizations that are proclaiming a shortage of water. And, of course, there isn't any shortage of water because there's no evidence that there's less water on Earth now than there was 100,000 years ago, or presumably when there was deemed to be plenty of water. The water hasn't been destroyed. There's still the same amount of water around. The difference is, I think, that we've polluted what water there is and we have too many people. And my main beef is that we're not thinking very well about this. We talk about a shortage of water. There's no shortage of water. There's a surplus of people.
So what would your solution be?
Well, it would be to manage the growth of water consumption. If you take, for example, in South Africa, where they have really very impressive water transfer schemes and water diversion schemes, where they're treating the entire country of Lesotho as essentially a water collection device and storing the water in the continent's greatest dams and tunneling with very impressive large diameter tunnels and gravitating the water out of that country towards the Transvaal, or where the Witwatersrand, where there's all the gold mining and there's the big population growth. Water transfers are going on. They are necessary. it would be a good idea, I think, to manage the need for water and the consumption of water if you can. But I accept that in Johannesburg you have the gold under the ground in Johannesburg and not in Lesotho. So you need to move the water from Lesotho to Johannesburg.
But what would that do to the water in Lesotho, let's say, to the water supply there?
Well, it seems at the moment, I mean, I don't know what the long-term consequences are likely to be, but it's a very rocky and mountainous country, and agriculture, for example, is quite difficult. So water is a commodity which they export, the result of which they're able to provide for most of the country's hydroelectricity needs, and it generates income for them. So if they have an excess of water, then I can understand that it's attractive, at least at this point in history, to export it to an area where there's a need for it. But the result of this is that there's an incredible population growth, at least compared to what we're used to in Canada, in those areas where there's no water. And it's conceivable, I suppose, that in the future the water might be needed in Lesotho, in which case there will be some awkward discussions necessary.
Well, and that's what we're hearing in Canada, that freshwater supplies are apparently going to become like gold, and that could lead to wars and such.
I think it's very important to maintain the integrity of the water and to try to live in a slightly more subtle ways. If we have the water in Canada, and if we're able to grow the foodstuffs in Canada, perhaps grains, and then we should grow the grains while we have the chance to grow the grains, store the grains, and distribute the grains from there. But to actually go to some desert country, and I am thinking of one now, but I'm not going to mention it because it'll be too difficult politically, to withdraw the water from the ground, which would essentially result in robbing neighboring countries of groundwater in order to render the desert green and to grow the produce there. That doesn't make sense to me, because we have the water here, we can grow the products here, we can ship them from here. Admittedly, there are energy implications for that, but in the long term, it would be better for the people to live where the water and the food is, and not in these desert areas, particularly if there's no obvious resources or need for them to be there.
So again, you wouldn't call this a water crisis per se, but it is in effect a water supply crisis due to population growth.
Yeah, I think it's purely a surplus of people. And the long-term solution there is to persuade people to reduce the population growth rate, and you do that by well-known methods, by emancipation of women, and by education. The problem is we've been calling it a water shortage.
Right.
And so we're coming up with all kinds of expensive and elaborate schemes for desalinating seawater, for example, and for transferring water and so on, instead of perhaps being more careful about where we should be keeping the people.
You've actually segued nicely to a couple of audience questions that were submitted. This is a question from Bill. Is desalination of water a viable option for creating drinking water?
Well, it works. I mean, it depends on the circumstances. But that's a very expensive way to do it. A country where they have surplus energy, or they think they do, but they're willing to use it up to desalinate the water. Sure, the water that they produce would be entirely drinkable. It's not at all a reasonable idea here in Guelph, obviously, because we're a long way from the sea and energy is very expensive and we don't particularly want to pollute, and we've got more than enough salt. We have huge salt mines here underground, so we don't, it's not feasible here, but in other places and circumstances.
The next question is from Angie. Bottled water marketing tends to portray tap water as dirty or unsafe. Is there any truth to those claims?
Well, there may be some local problems with the water distribution. Waterton had a problem. There was a cow that had diarrhea and the water ran down the side of the well and these coliforms got into the drinking water and it was tragic what happened in Waterton here in Ontario. Piped drinking water can be hazardous, I suppose, but it's unlikely to be. And I think that the price we're paying for bottled water, and it's really quite funny, I've been to some of these bottled water plants, and they are pulling the water out of the ground in circumstances that are not remotely as well controlled and as sanitary as the local communities. But I think the price we're paying is with the plastic bottles and the solid wastes and the distribution, marketing, the packaging, the whole bit, it seems to me very silly. I ran a conference last week here in Toronto, and of course the hotel was more than willing to supply bottled water at about $4 for a little glassful.
Right.
And I said, absolutely not. Nobody's going to drink bottled water. This is a water. Everybody's going to drink out of jugs. Isabel Heathcote did a study before she got her chair here at the University of Guelph. She's retired now. And she collected water over Ontario, both from bottled water and from drinking water, and consistently found that the municipal drinking water was better quality.
Oh, that's good to know. And the last question. How is global climate change affecting the supply of fresh water?
I'm not very sympathetic to this cries about global warming. It's not that it isn't global warming. I truly believe there is. And it's not that it's not serious. I believe that it is. But there's other issues which seem to me much more significant. One is the human population growth. The other is the inexorable process of covering the landscape in pavement, either from rooftops, driveways, roads, gutters. We're paving one end of this continent to the other. And the significance of that in terms of the water budget, the water balance, groundwater, the clarity of the water, the pollution of the water, is probably an order of magnitude, if not more, than the effect of global warming. So it seems to me really surprising that we are prepared to worry about those issues, spend scads of money on research and concern ourselves about it. Meantime, we're allowing urbanization and urban development to proceed unabated.
I love that I asked a very controversial question last when we don't have time to deal with it at all. If anyone does want to hear more about climate change, the most recent episode we've done on it, and we've done more than one, is number 62, The Evidence for Climate Change. And I will make sure to never ask you very controversial questions, the last question of the show. Thanks so much for being here, Bill.
You're welcome.
And you can check out Bill's work at chiwater.com. We're linked to it at our site at skepticallyspeaking.com. And we'll be right back with more after these messages.
Skeptically Speaking is rebroadcast on a number of fine radio stations. To find out where Skeptically Speaking airs near you, to listen to past episodes, or download the weekly podcast, check out our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, follow the links to connect with us on our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, or to subscribe to the show in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
I'm here with Marc Grynpas, PhD. Marc is a professor in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology, and a member of the Institute for Biomaterial and Biomedical Engineering at the University of Toronto. Welcome to Skeptically Speaking, Marc.
Hello, Desiree. Nice to hear your voice.
Well, let's start with a bit about the history of fluoridation. When did fluoride start being added to drinking water?
Well, I think fluoride started to be added to drinking water in the 50s. And I believe the first city was in Michigan. I can't remember the name of the actual town. People had found that at a low level, it prevented dental caries, and it was done as a public health measure So people who didn't have dental care or didn't take care of their teeth could actually have healthy teeth and enamel.
Well, how exactly was the connection made between fluoride and tooth decay?
Well, it was discovered I can't remember exactly the place, but there was a river and there's a tributary. And people further from that tributary had normal tooth with dental decay, and people down the tributary, which received this water from the river, which had a fair amount of fluoride, had very good teeth. And then people made connection between some fluoride in the water and the fact that teeth were carie-free.
How is it added to the water exactly?
I'm not exactly sure of the chemistry of what they put in the water, but they put mineral which contain fluoride and then purify it. So basically what you have, the same way you add chlorine to the water as an antibacterial agent, you add fluoride into the water to help with caries. And the reason it helps with caries, the mechanism, is that at that level, fluoride doesn't affect the cells, doesn't have a biological effect. It has a physical chemical effect on the enamel because the enamel is made of crystals called apatite. And the fluoride can substitute for called hydroxyl in the apatite lattice and make it more stable, less likely to be attacked by acid that we have in our mouth.
Now, have we seen evidence of improvement in dental health since we started adding fluoride?
It wasn't universally accepted. Some people refused, and that's what we did the study between Toronto and Montreal. In the city where there was no fluoridated water, there were a lot more dental caries in the city which there was fluoride in the water, and that was the reason why it was added. So it did make a large difference, and especially for the people who didn't have dental care, who couldn't afford dental care, it was a great help.
And your research is fascinating, and that's the reason why we're here today. But before we get to that, let's just briefly address the issue of safety. And we'll definitely go more into detail later on. But in your opinion, is fluoridated water safe?
At the level at which it's fluoridated, which is 1 ppm or lower, there's been many studies, and it's never been shown that it has any effect other than prevent dental caries. And it is for this reason, because some people say, well, how do you know that if you drink this water for 30, 40 years, it doesn't affect your skeleton? Because fluoride goes to teeth and bone. And that's why we decided to do this study. But the maximum allowable in North America is 4 parts per million. They say that you can start seeing some effect, biological effect. But at 1 ppm or less, there is no evidence of any toxic side effect.
Well, one of the things we talk quite a bit about on Skeptically Speaking is about the concept of scientific consensus and what that means. And so while we can't say that there is 100% scientific consensus on really any topic, there is a certain point that we can say that the vast majority of scientists in a specific field agree. So broadly, how much scientific consensus is there that supports your position?
Well, let's take the organization Health Canada, the FDA, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, the World Health Organization. All of these bodies have recommended fluoridating water. There's been multiple studies by the National Research Council in the States, Health Protection Branch of Health Canada, and in Europe as well. And there's been what you call meta-analysis. It's an analysis of all of the papers published on epidemiological study to see if there was any problem. And they say, if anything, it'd be a very minimal effect on bone. Nobody's ever found at that level some toxicity. Like every element, you can't say, is it good or bad for you? What you can say is that what dose it is toxic or at what dose is it dangerous. But the dose at 1 ppm, I don't believe that anybody's ever shown that it was toxic.
Exactly. So just to be clear, though, what you're talking about are sort of average fluoridation levels, but excessive fluoride exposure can have some very negative consequences.
Absolutely. It's like everything in life. If I say, is sun good for you? If you don't have any sun, you can get osteomalacia and ricket. If you have too much sun, you can get cancer. So in particular for fluoride, it's very complicated because fluoride is an element and it affects bones and teeth. It has a physico-chemical effect on the crystals of bone and of teeth. Now, if you increase the dose, it starts having an effect on bone cells. Now, if you increase the dose a little bit more, it becomes toxic. You can get a disease called skeletal fluorosis. You can get dental fluorosis. So those are very bad diseases. And the area of the world where naturally the fluoride content of the water is very high, and people do get this disease. There's also another element, and that is the genetic susceptibility of people to fluoride vary. So for instance, people who got a medium dose of fluoride as a drug against osteoporosis, there was about 30% of people which are called non-responder. They got the dose, but nothing happened. In the same way, in area of the world with very high fluoride in the water, you get this skeletal fluorosis, probably between half and three-quarters of the people are not affected. It complicates things. But yes, they are safe dose, medium dose, and toxic dose.
Now, I just wanted to attend to the elephant in the room. So I promise everyone listening we'll get into more safety issues in more detail later on in the show. You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking to Dr. Marc Grynpas, Director of the Bone and Mineral Research Group at the University of Toronto. Today's topic is water fluoridation. So let's talk about some of the research that you just brought up. So your primary focus on a regular basis is on the skeletal system, correct?
Absolutely correct.
So the first study that we found, which is actually the one that made us curious to talk to you, was called The Long-Term Effects of Water Fluoridation on the Human Skeleton. So tell us about that study.
The question we asked was, what happens if somebody drinks for a lifetime fluoridated water? The usual way people would address these kinds of things would do, say, an animal study where you jack up the dose. But you can't do that because high dose for short term are totally different than low dose for a very long time. So the only way we could do this study is to do it on humans. And so people have done epidemiologic study comparing a city to another city, or a city where water was not fluoridated to after it was fluoridated. We decided to take another tack. We took femoral head when people had hip replacement. And these femoral head, about 2/3 of them came from Toronto, where water has been fluoridated for now over 40 years. And from Montreal, where water was never fluoridated because the old mayor of Montreal, Jean Drapeau, refused. And we took femoral head for people who live in this area for most of their life and actually compare the mechanical property of the bone in this femoral head to the content of the fluoride in this femoral head. So this way we could tell if, one, there was a difference between the two cities, two, the difference between the two cities was the same as the difference between the high fluoride and the low fluoride, and three, to compare the given property to the bone content of fluoride.
So what were your results then?
If we compare Toronto and Montreal, we found difference. But those differences were not the same as the difference between the people at high fluoride and low fluoride. And we didn't find any correlation between the fluoride content of the bone in our study and, let's say, the mechanical property or the mineralization. So if fluoride has an effect on the bone after 40 years, it's not detectable. If we take the bone fluoride content of the people in Toronto and the people in Montreal, in average, the people in Toronto have more fluoride than the people in Montreal. However, there are some people in Toronto, even though they've lived 40 years, they've drank for 40 years fluoridated water, they've actually a bone fluoride content which is lower than the average in Montreal. So genetic susceptibility has a part in it, age has a part in it, disease has an effect because if you have osteoporosis, postmenopausal, you are forming and resorbing bone at a high rate, so you may lose some fluoride. If you have kidney problem, you have another problem because you may not excrete the fluoride. So it is, in a way, extremely difficult to tease out things. But one thing we can say for sure from this study is that drinking fluoridated water for 40 years does not directly affect your skeleton.
Well, we actually have a question on that specific topic from Gary in Medicine Hat.
What are the difficulties in doing studies on the effects of fluoride on long-term human physiology? It appears to be very difficult to do randomized blinded tests and to take into account the many other factors involved. What does this suggest about the practice of water fluoridation?
The reason people do epidemiologic studies is because they take a very, very big number of people and they're trying to account for the many, many variables. In medicine, in general, it's very difficult to predict things. For instance, what you're really interesting in osteoporosis is, are you going to fracture? Well, what you're measuring is bone mineral density, because you cannot measure on a person the mechanical property of their bone. However, bone mineral density is a very poor predictor of fracture. So that's the problem with all study done on humans.
So we've had fluoridated water for about, 50 to 60 years? So was this the first study that looked at how it affected the skeleton, or at least the first long-term study? And if that's the case, then were we just not able to come to any kind of definitive conclusion before this?
We're not the first study, but most other studies are studies which are more, like epidemiology. You may give people a questionnaire, you measure their bone mineral density, you may even measure fluoride level in the serum, but you cannot take a piece of bone of somebody and measure fluoride content in the bone and measure the mechanical property. So in a way, we were the first to go and take bone sample of people who had been a very, very long time in one area versus people that have been a very long time in the other area and compare them. So in a way, it's a different kind of study. Of course, it's very reduced. We only can use 90 femoral head. But what it did show is that if you actually look in the bone itself, you cannot find really a difference.
So what would you say then, what is the practical use of this study?
The practical use of this study is that if you're in Montreal or if you're in Toronto, fluoride will not affect your skeleton if you've drunk fluoridated water for a very long time. However, the dental bill of somebody who lives in Toronto will be much better than somebody who's in Montreal. Especially affect the poor and the people who cannot afford dental health have suffered from this decision not to fluoridate.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking to Dr. Marc Grynpas, Director of the Bone and Mineral Research Group at the University of Toronto. Today's topic is water fluoridation. You've been talking about variability, and you mentioned genetic factors. So can you explain that? Because at least we know that in mice at this point.
Right. We did a study using 3 different types of mice they call strain. One which is resistant, and one which is sensitive, and one which is in the middle. Now, we gave those young mice very high level of fluoride in their water, and then we found that in one strain of mice, there was no difference in their skeleton. The mechanical property were the same, no difference. In the sensitive strain, there was a very great decrease in the mechanical property. And of course, in the intermediate strain, it went in between. So you say, well, that's specific to mice. Well, actually, that's not true. Because, as I mentioned before, there are areas in the world where we have very high, naturally high fluoridated water. There's some area in India, there's some area in China, and I know of some area in Brazil. There was a study specifically in India done where you took a village which had a naturally very high fluoride content in the water, and compared to a village who had a regular amount of fluoride in the water. And then you have children, we have this disease called skeletal fluorosis, where the legs are crooked, the spine is crooked, and often even tendons and ligaments get calcified. But what is very astonishing, it's only 1/4 of the children in that area were affected. the other 3/4 of children drank the same water. They had the same diet. So it's very important to realize that there is a genetic component. And we found that in our study between Montreal and Toronto, people who've lived in Toronto for all their life, at least 40 years in there, drinking fluoridated water, had a bone content of fluoride, which was lower than people in Montreal who didn't drink fluoridated water. No, I must add that it's not just water where you get fluoride, because fluoride is a trace element. You get into fish, in tea, in many other ways. It's practically impossible not to have any amount of fluoride. On the other hand, you can have toxic amount of fluoride. So again, it's a question of, in one hand, dose, and in the other hand, how susceptible you are to fluoride.
I'm curious about fluorosis because you've used that term a couple of times, and in some of the research I've done, it seems to mean sort of a range of things, does it not?
Well, there's two types of fluorosis. There is dental fluorosis and there's skeletal fluorosis. Those are different. If you are exposed as a child, as an infant, to too high fluoride, then the enamel, which is the white part of your teeth, the covering of your teeth, will not form properly, will be mottled, and then eventually will be weak, and there's various degrees of. Now, once your teeth are formed, then there's nothing anymore, because the effect of fluoride on the enamel, unless it's during formation, but once your teeth are formed, is a purely physical-chemical effect, because you have bacteria there, and they create acid, which start eroding the enamel of your teeth. Now, if you add fluoride, fluoroapatite tend to be more resistant to acid attack than is regular apatite. So that's the mechanism by which fluoride protects teeth. Now, if you've got too much when you're very young, then you can have very bad enamel because it doesn't form properly. So that's the dental fluorosis problem. Now, the skeletal fluorosis is a bigger problem in the sense that you have an even higher level, and then you're affecting your skeleton. Because what happens when you ingest fluoride? It goes to your teeth and it goes to your bone. And what doesn't go to the teeth or the bone gets excreted. Now, you have to realize that what goes into the bone, let's say you got X amount going to your bone, it takes much longer to eliminate it because some of it is reabsorbed when bone gets resolved.
So now how does this relate to genetic susceptibility? Are people more likely to get fluorosis if they are genetically susceptible to fluoride then?
Yes, they are. But as far as the reason for genetic susceptibility, that's a much more complicated one. Because how can you be genetically susceptible to an element? So we did some studies, and one of the hypotheses we have is that fluoride can act at different levels. At very low dose, it can act on the physical-chemical effect on your enamel. At a higher dose, it affects bone cell, it affects bone formation and resorption. But it also affects bone structure. And it also affects the interface between the crystals of bone and the organic matrix, the collagen, the non-collagenous protein. And it may be that it's this interface which is affected by the fluoride ion, because the fluoride ion is the most electronegative ion. So it may attack that interface, and some people may have a stronger interface than others. And that's where the genetic susceptibility, we believe, occurs.
So if you are susceptible, then, should you avoid fluoridated tap water?
No, because as I mentioned, at the level it's given in the water, it does not affect our biology. It does not affect cells, does not affect bone. There's a threshold under which fluoride will not affect biology. And that's where the fluoridated water is. And it's a topical effect, if you want, on our teeth.
We have a question from Melissa.
Do household water filters, Brita, Pure, etc., remove the fluoride from tap water?
I am not sure, but I believe so. I believe because those are what they call charcoal filter. They will remove things like fluoride, chloride, chlorine, and so forth.
I hate to say it, sir, but I think you might be wrong. I do believe I read something to the contrary, but I could be wrong.
This is not my area.
No, absolutely. We are fine with engaging in speculation as long as we say it's speculation. All right, so let's take a wee break, and we will be right back after this.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we look at how humanity is changing the water that sustains us. Researcher Liz Borkowski joins us for a look at the connection between sewage and civilization and the struggle to introduce modern sanitation in the developing world. And we'll talk to Dr. Alistair Boxall about the sources and effects of pharmaceutical contaminants in the environment. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking, Friday night at 6 Mountain Time at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell, and I'm talking today with Dr. Marc Grynpas. Marc is a professor in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology at the University of Toronto and a senior scientist at the Samuel Lunenfeld Research Institute of Mount Sinai Hospital. So really, this has turned into the fluoride safety show, which I kind of assumed it would. So part of the concern around water fluoridation comes down to appropriate levels of fluoride in water, and you have mentioned that. So how is that fluoride level decided exactly?
Originally, in the US, it was decided that up to 4 parts per million was safe, and above that it became questionable. So even though it was up to 4 it was safe, they decided that 1 was the appropriate level. Now, they have actually said that 2 ppm is probably better than 4, and people have decreased the amount of fluoride. I mean, Toronto, I think, has gone to 0.7 part per million. The reason for this is that a lot of what we ingest is actually made with fluoridated water. A lot of the toothpaste contain a lot of fluoride. And the amount of fluoride, if you want, in what we consume has probably increased. So people are always trying to get the minimum effective dose, which will allow for the desired benefit.
So is this something that requires tweaking dependent on variables? Are there different optimal levels of fluoridation in different locations?
I think so too. I had a student, which is now a professor in Brazil, and she was studying, the effect of fluoride on teeth, and it depends on temperature, it depends on all sorts of factors. So in Brazil, the level, I believe, was slightly higher than it was here, and also it depends on what's the average consumption of people. The average intake of fluoride by various people, which is actually extremely low. You assume that people drink about 1.5 liters of water or water-like, juice or whatever, and they eat so much fish, they drink so much tea, and so forth, because some food contain more fluoride than others, naturally. So, depending if you never drink tea or if you always eat fish, or you can have more or less amount of fluoride that you ingest. Now, you have to realize that the amount of fluoride you ingest, half of it will go to your bone, half of it will be excreted. And again, now, depending on your health, there will be a certain amount of variability. But the amount which is designed to protect your teeth, what is important is the topical effect. If you drink very quickly and your teeth don't see the water, it doesn't have any effect. That's why fluoride was added in toothpaste and in mouthwash and in all these products in order to make sure that there's enough fluoride on your enamel to protect it.
Now, I think that answers the question from T. Kurek.
How can a safe level be established if people show different levels of vulnerability, such as may be caused by kidney problems?
Yes, kidney problems is a big problem because that's where a lot of the fluoride is excreted. So if you cannot excrete it, obviously you're going to keep it inside and it's going to go to your bone. You're going to have a greater amount which will stay inside.
And that's one of the issues with fluoridation of water. One of the reasons why it's so controversial is just because it's not affecting only one field. I did receive a question from the audience that we won't be covering on the air tonight, and it was about IQ and fluoride. And there are no neurologists on tonight's episode, so we won't be talking about that. But this is highly controversial. And actually, there's a question about that. This is from Plain Ray.
Do different countries have a different perception of the impact of fluoridation?
I haven't studied all countries. I'm mainly familiar with North America. But I can tell you that the World Health Organization has recommended fluoride. And in the World Health Organization, most countries are members of this. So I don't think this is an exclusively North American thing.
And I just wanted to let people know that T. Kurek actually sent us the answer to our question that I called out. Thank you very much. It says only reverse osmosis, alumina oxide filters, and water distillation removes fluoride. Brita filters only remove the odor and small amounts of chloride. And we will, of course, be confirming that after the show. So sticking with the safety issue, because that's what people want to talk about. I'd like to read you some of the honestly kind of frightening quotes from the anti-fluoridation websites that I looked at, and maybe just have you comment on them. The chemicals most used to fluoridate drinking water are silicofluorides, contaminated waste product of industry that were never tested on humans or animals.
You know, like you said, I had to stick to my knowledge. I'm not really familiar with what is put in the water. Mm-hmm. But, you know, like I don't believe in conspiracy theory. And I don't think that people will knowingly put poison in the water in order to do something good for public health. I mean, one of the reasons Drapeau was against, and many other people in the 60s and the 70s were against fluoridation, it was because it was a communist plot.
Right.
So it's always been an emotional issue. And I'm trying to do is to look at fact and scientific fact and see what the mechanisms are and what is we can reasonably find from experiment.
And I think that's all any of us can do at this point. You know, we do try and be as objective as possible, and we do welcome questions from both sides of the aisle, as it were. So there's another quote that I found that I was wondering about, and just wondering sort of how it compared with what you see. Dental fluorosis is estimated at 41% among adolescents aged 12 to 15. Now again, dental fluorosis is just the cosmetic aspect, but it can be more serious?
Yes. You see, that's the big problem. If everybody would agree on what a word means,
right,
it wouldn't be a problem. But, you know, people can call dental fluorosis something which is aesthetic at one hand and which really is a problem at the other hand. Because if an infant, as they grow, is exposed to too much fluoride, then will have an effect on the formation of its enamel, which will be not as good as normal enamel and therefore will not protect the teeth the same way. That is serious dental fluorosis. Most of the dental fluorosis is an aesthetic problem. It's not that. So if we can define what we mean and agree on, okay, this is a problem, this is not, then would be better off. But I don't know where the 40% come from. It's possible that it's published, but I mean, a lot of things are published, and we have to look at it skeptically, as you mentioned.
We have a question from Greg Layden via Facebook.
What is the current thinking on fluoride in tap water used to make formula from powder for infants? I'm pretty sure it's recommended that this fluoride be avoided, as it may be too much when added to other sources. I think the age through which this is recommended has recently been changed from 12 to 18 months by the American Dental Association. What are your thoughts about this?
The time at which the problem for teeth is most critical is when enamel is formed. So it may be better to put it later, and if the Dental Association is recommend that, I'm sure that this is based on fact, on things they've seen. So remember I said the reason why dental fluorosis is a problem is that if you're exposed to too much fluoride while your teeth are forming, then there may be a serious consequence.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking. We're discussing water fluoridation with Dr. Marc Grynpas, professor in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology and director of the Bone and Mineral Research Group at the University of Toronto. There's a lot of information here, and I'm just wondering, looking at all of this from a city planning or public health perspective, would you say that the benefits of adding fluoride to the public water systems outweigh the risks?
Oh, definitely. I mean, many of the bodies which are involved in public health have come down, saying fluoride is a good thing. And the people at the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta have called it one of the great public health success of the 20th century. Many scientists, doctors, and dentists will not come and say this if it was not true. And we can see one of the elements that we see now, we see an uptick in the number of caries in places like Toronto because people are drinking bottled water.
And for the vast majority of people, there won't be an issue just from drinking and using simple tap water.
No, there won't be an issue, certainly not of safety.
So let's go the other way then. What are the risks of not fluoridating water? Because there have been a few places in Canada that have recently decided to stop adding fluoride to the water system. So how could that affect people's health?
Well, it will certainly affect people's budget when they will have to bring their children and themselves to the dentist, especially if they don't have dental coverage. And it was designed in order to cover people who cannot afford dental health. And so those are the people who are going to suffer from removing fluoride from the water at the level it was there before.
And that's actually one of my big concerns, and a concern that I've seen expressed repeatedly is specifically for people who are living in poverty and who may not be brushing their teeth regularly. It's not really at the top of their list of things to do. How could not fluoridating water affect them?
Well, it will force them to go to the dentist or have many caries and then have their teeth removed. And poor dental health is not just poor dental health. There's been a study done by the National Institute of Health in the States which shows that in elderly people, poor dental health can have poor health consequences. The bacteria in the mouth can go down and affect your heart and affect other organs. So poor dental health is not just concerning your mouth, it will eventually affect other organs. So it's not negligible.
As we've seen this episode, this is a controversial topic in many places around the world right now. So what aspects of fluoride do you think are in need of more study at this point?
The most important thing when we do this study is to try and understand what is the mechanism by which fluoride has its effect. The more we understand the mechanism, the more we can have sound judgment, the more we can make decisions which are based on knowledge as opposed to based on emotion.
I think that really covers a lot of areas.
Absolutely.
Marc, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
There's a link to the lab of Dr. Marc Grynpas on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While we were researching the different opinions on water fluoridation, we contacted the Canadian Dental Association to ask for their perspective. They provided us with a statement on the use and safety of fluoride. They said in part that the Canadian Dental Association supports the appropriate use of fluorides in dentistry as one of the most successful preventative health measures in the history of healthcare. Over 50 years of extensive research throughout the world has consistently demonstrated the safety and effectiveness of fluorides in the prevention of dental caries. CDA supports fluoridation of municipal drinking water as a safe, effective, and economical means of preventing dental caries in all age groups. You'll find a link to the complete statement on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, click the links to Facebook, to Twitter, and to iTunes, where you can listen to past episodes, subscribe to the podcast, or leave a review. As we were preparing for this show, we realized that we were finding so much interesting research on so many topics that we couldn't possibly fit it into one show. So join us again next week when we'll look at what happens to water after it goes down the drain. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell, gonna raise a little hell, break the spell of Pavlov's bells. Cause we're skeptically speaking, on mind reading tarot cards and witches, psychics, and their spoon-bending mind tricks. All the humbug, flim-flam, frauds and shams, the charlatan woo. I don't think you understand, it's the hocus pocus, out of focus locus, eroding the brain, making gains on the hopeless. Let the crystal ball fall, smash on the floor, leave the pieces alone, we don't need them anymore. Just a microscope, telescope, magnifier, reading in between the lines of these lies. Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter, your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell, gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is, cause we're skeptically speaking.